There's something quietly disorienting about a place that everyone thinks they already understand. When most people hear Fort Knox, a single image snaps into focus: vaults, gold, military guards, a humming, bureaucratic certainty. But behind that public-facing image, beyond the concrete, the fences, the bright, ridiculous myth of an impregnable treasure trove, lies a landscape older and stranger than the headlines. It hums with a different kind of vaulting, not of metal or cash, but of time. Soil remembers. Stones remember. Rivers remember. And at Fort Knox, those memories refuse to be tidy. They leak into the present as puzzles that science, with all its tools and goodwill, still cannot fully explain. That tension, between what you think you know and what the land quietly insists upon, is where our story begins. Picture it: dew on the grass, fog clinging to the fields, a road that seems ordinary until it curls and opens onto a rise where the air feels, inexplicably, a degree colder. Now picture the rise dotted with low earth and mounds, not the tidy formations of modern landscaping but old, weathered swells the colors of tea-stained paper. The local guide will tell you they're just burial mounds, the product of woodland or Adena cultures, carefully catalogued, partially excavated, classified, filed. That's the expectation. The surprise, the mystery, is this: some of those mounds, when examined with modern techniques, whisper dates and arrangements that don't fit neat timelines. Some align to the horizon in ways that make astronomers sit up. Some contain artifacts crafted from materials that hint at trade routes impossible for their supposed era. We promise you big revelations in the hours that follow. We promise conflicting evidence, scientific debates, the creatures of folktales, sort of stories people tell after the lights go out. But above all, we promise an invitation to stand with us at the boundary where fact shades into wonder, and to stay curious. Because for every firm answer at Fort Knox, there are 6 questions that nudge like an insistent hand. Who built this, and why? How old really is this place? What knowledge was lost when the maps were burned? And why, across centuries and cultures, do people keep returning to the same points on the land to place stones, to bury their dead, to mark the sky? We begin with a paradox. Modernity guards the vault, yet beneath it are traces of hands that predate the nation itself. The records, federal surveys, archaeological dig notes, oral histories, are generous with data but lean on certainty. Carbon dates, stratigraphy, pottery styles, they are our lanterns in the dark. Yet lanterns have limits. Radiocarbon curves wiggle, soil layers are disturbed by animals, by floods, by centuries of foot traffic. And so the deeper you look, the more the past looks like a palimpsest, text half-scraped, overwritten, with unexpected sentences showing through. In the best stories of discovery, those sentences become the hinge. At Fort Knox, they are the hinges on which our understanding of ancient North America might swing. Here's the thing about mystery as an emotion: it is both a humbling force and a stubborn engine. It reminds you, gently and then with a little shove, that human beings have always been explorers of meaning. We orient ourselves by stones and stars, by trade goods and myths. When scientists and folklorists, amateur metal detectorists and descendants of the land all gather in the same field, the debate becomes a chorus. Some of the voices speak slow and careful with evidence, others quick and bright with memory. Sometimes they harmonize, sometimes they argue so fiercely the arguments themselves become part of the lore. We will walk through 6 distinct, woven mysteries in this landscape, sites that are physically near Fort Knox but temporally and culturally far-reaching. Each will be its own small world. A single sentence can tease the shape, but the texture will come from dates, from artifacts, from the theories that refuse to agree with each other. Each will end the same way, with a line that cannot be smoothed away. We still don't know. So let's walk. Put your hand in mine as we cross a gravel road that was once a trail and feel the air change. Hear the roosters cry far off, the dull throb of traffic at a distance, and the small, almost ceremonial rustle of wind through tall grass. Imagine, for a moment, that the map you're holding is not a finite thing but a conversation. We will listen hard to the land and to the people who remember it, because both have things to tell us that textbooks might have missed. It won't be tidy. It will be better for it. The first site we encounter sits on a bluff that overlooks a bend in the Salt River, a bluff locals call Stonewatch, and here the mystery is written in silence. Stonewatch, where a circle of massive stones falls out of harmony with the map of known builders. The teasing sentence is simple. These stones look deliberate, too deliberately placed for chance, yet they do not match any catalogued megalithic tradition in the region. When you walk among them, you feel the human scales shift. What felt like a pasture becomes an arena of intent. The stones are not skyscraper-sized, but they are heavy and roughly dressed, some tilted as though adjusting their posture toward the sunrise on a particular day. Carbon dates from nearby charcoal layers suggest human activity around 200 BC to 400 C, which would place these arrangements in the era of Hopewell and late Adena activity, cultures renowned for their earthworks and artistry. But here's where it gets tricky. The stone arrangement's axis aligns with a stellar event that, according to archaeoastronomers' models, would have been most visible and significant nearly 500 years earlier. In other words, either the builders were keeping astronomical time in a way that spanned centuries, or our dating is missing a key chapter. The artifacts found loosely within the circle complicate the story further. There are worked copper fragments that bear traces of malachite staining, suggesting a source of ore from regions far to the north. Lake Superior country, perhaps, well beyond what one might expect for regular trade at that time. That kind of long-distance exchange is not unheard of. Hopewell networks shipped mica, obsidian, and marine shells over vast distances. But the workmanship on several copper plates found there is idiosyncratic. The motifs do not correspond neatly to Hopewell iconography or to Mississippian styles that came later. Some specialists propose that Stonewatch was a liminal site, a place where traders, pilgrims, and diverse groups met and exchanged ritual objects in a deliberate cultural patchwork. Another theory suggests a continuous cultic tradition so conservative it preserved an older astronomical alignment long after surrounding cultures shifted. Now, let's be fair, erosion, animal burrowing, and later human disturbance can create false patterns. Still, for all the evidence, the arrangement's precision suggests intention. Local lore makes the stones sing with another voice. Old county stories, told in voice-raspy whispers in places where the curtains are thin, speak of giant markers, placed by a people of great stature, not always a scientific term, but one that captures the human tendency to explain scale by imagining larger-than-life ancestors. One tale mentions a farmer in the 19th century who claimed his plow hit a bone so big it looked like a column. Subsequent attempts to locate such remains turned up nothing conclusive, but monstrous skeleton narratives persist in communities where the stones occupy the mind like a shared dream. Picture yourself walking the foggy trail at dawn, light knifing the stone's edges, birds indifferent to human stories. The stones watch, silent. You can almost hear a calendar flip in the wind. We still don't know whether Stonewatch marks a lost calendrical system, a trader's hostel, or something more symbolic, a claim of place by a people whose names we have forgotten. That uncertainty is exactly why we keep looking. Not far from Stonewatch, downriver in a bowl of mist and cattails, lies a lone mound known to archaeologists as the Golden Ridge Mound, though here, golden, does not refer to bullion but to a sheen of pyrite and to the stories of a buried hoard, an expectation that color and myth have braided together. The teaser for this place is quick. Golden Ridge hides a stratigraphy that confounds carbon curves and contains artifacts that predate known settlement patterns by centuries. When formal excavation began in the mid-20th century, teams found typical woodland pottery and flint tools interleaved with radiocarbon samples that suggested an even earlier occupation, as early as 800 BC in some samples, earlier than some regional typologies would comfortably allow for the complexity observed. The mound's core returned a staggering concentration of worked stone blades, each thin as a whisper and extremely flat, whose production suggested a mastery of knapping rarely seen in contemporaneous layers. Also present were beads of marine shell and a few worked pieces of turquoise, commodities that imply distant exchange routes, perhaps even maritime contacts we have yet to map with precision. Here's where it gets tricky. One of the most enigmatic finds at Golden Ridge was not an object at all but a discoloration in the soil, a dark stain that, under microscopic analysis, contained traces of plant resins and what some chemists tentatively identified as an early form of asphaltic sealant. The presence of such a substance hints at technical knowledge of bituminous materials for sealing or ritualizing, knowledge we associate in other regions with advanced craft traditions. Competing theories argue for different readings. One school of thought posits that Golden Ridge represents a center of craft specialization, a place where itinerant artisans congregated to produce items for a broad trade network. Another suggests it was a long-term habitation site where technological innovations were preserved across generations, explaining the mixture of early and late dates. Yet another, more sensational, claim floated by a small number of amateur researchers and propagated on late-night radio, speculates about a hoard of pre-contact metalworking skills lost in time. Now, let's be fair, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. There are troubling gaps in the dataset, including the disturbed context of some finds and potential contamination of samples. Still, for all the careful analysis, Golden Ridge resists a single tidy narrative. Mythologically, Golden Ridge feeds into the American imagination of secret hoards and buried cities. Local children grow up on a mix of practical caution and fantastical rumor. Don't dig by the old willow, they're told. Some things are better left sleeping. There are stories of lost boats, visible only on certain fog-heavy nights, of drums heard under the earth when the wind is wrong. Picture yourself kneeling at the mound's edge as rain begins to tap, the smell of wet clay rising, and imagine scraping back the layers to find not just artifacts but craft traces that might rewrite a page of technological history. We still don't know if Golden Ridge marks a place of innovation, a crossroads on a forgotten trade artery, or a ceremonial site that reused ancestral materials to anchor cultural memory. And we should admit something else. Human imagination has a way of turning absence into wonder. Sometimes the things we cannot explain are amplified by our desire to explain them, and that hunger can be both illuminating and misleading. A mile beyond the ridge, under the glassy calm of a reservoir the Army Corps built in the 20th century, there is a drowned terrace that divers and sonar maps have hinted may hold straight lines and right angles under the silt, what some call the submerged grid. The teaser is concise. Under modern water, echoes of engineered space hint at planning and maybe even urbanity long before we'd expect it. To the lay ear, that sounds like a romantic assertion. To surveyors and remote sensing specialists, it's an invitation to be skeptical and exact. Sonar scans show interruptions in sediment consistent with human-made features, embankments, a sequence of post holes, perhaps the remnants of wooden structures preserved in anaerobic mud. When the reservoir was drained briefly in an emergency in the 1970s, a small team went in with shovels and cameras, finding charred timbers and square nails that date to much later periods. But the sonar anomalies persisted even after modern artifacts were accounted for, pointing below to earlier horizons. Dating submerged features is notoriously difficult. Waterlogged sites can preserve organic materials whether they are 300 or 3,000 years old, but disentangling the layers, knowing what washed into what and when, is exacting work. One lead archaeologist suggested a multi-episodic occupation, indigenous groups using the terrace seasonally for fishing and ceremonies, later European settlers building temporary structures, and then the Army's engineers changing the hydrology in a way that trapped this palimpsest underwater. Another theory argues for the provocative possibility that the submerged lines reflect deliberate landscape design from a pre-contact, urban, experiment, a dense arrangement of storage pits and platforms akin to marketplaces observed in other continents, but adapted here to a riverine environment. Skeptics caution that our tendency to see grids is human. Rivers and floodplains naturally deposit sediments in linear fashion, and natural root channels can mimic post holes on sonar. Still, for all the caution, teams keep returning to the reservoir with new equipment, because there is something compelling about a structure planned at scale, a collective investment that suggests social complexity. Local ghost stories graft themselves onto the submerged grid. As ghost stories do, fishermen swear the water's surface sometimes keeps a shape, a ripple in the fog that looks like a wall where no wall exists. Older residents recall a night when an elder pointed his flashlight to the water and muttered of cities under glass, in a tone halfway between sadness and reverence. Picture yourself drifting on a slow boat under a low sky, the oars hardly breathing, while the sonar beeps like a heart under your feet. The water is a mirror and a mask. We still don't know whether those straight lines are the faint thumprints of intentional construction or the tricks of geologic processes, whether there was ever a dense human settlement here or simply a place used seasonally, and then submerged by forces beyond any single generation's control. The next place we walked to seems, on first glance, almost prosaic, a stretch of hollowed-out sandstone along a backrail where graffiti has accumulated over the decades like new lichen. But beneath the modern names and dates is a deeper, older script, a sequence of cupules and petroglyphs whose motifs recall iconography more often seen in far-flung regions. The teaser is sharp. At Sand Whisper Canyon, Peck designs on stone suggest symbolic links with cultures thousands of miles away. Archaeologists documented the petroglyphs in the late 20th century and published careful drawings that included spirals, arcs, and a repeated motif of concentric circles pierced by short rays. Stylistically, some of these patterns echo motifs found along the Gulf Coast shell temple contexts and, in more distant echoes, in Proto-Atlantic art thousands of miles to the east. The radiocarbon evidence in midden deposits nearby places human activity at Sand Whisper across a broad range, roughly 1000 BC to 1200 C. The long horizon suggests either a persistent symbolic tradition or a site repeatedly reinterpreted by different peoples. Here's where it gets tricky. Chemical analyses of pigment residues on some of the pecked surfaces revealed trace elements that could indicate the use of ochres mixed with binders derived from coastal plants not commonly found inland. That hints at deliberate importation of materials. But the motif's closest formal parallels exist in coastal or even transatlantic contexts, leading some commentators, always the more sensational ones, to ask whether technological parallels represent direct contact, parallel invention, or long-distance symbolic diffusion across trade networks. Now, let's be fair, similarity of motifs does not equal direct contact. Patterns can converge independently when human cognition responds to similar symbolic needs. Still, for all the evidence, there remains an odd fit, petroglyphs designed with the precision of seafaring people, using pigments whose components point toward the coast, located inland beyond the easiest trade routes of the time. The myths here are deliciously cinematic, a people who carried the ocean in their pockets, leaving a handful of shells and a symbol to tell a secret. Elders in surrounding communities speak of a salt-bearer clan who traveled inland to trade and to perform rites, leaving marks as a kind of signature. Picture yourself in the canyon as evening lays down its blanket, the peck circles catching the last light, each groove like a small river. You run your fingers along the ancient cuts, not to damage, but to feel the reach of a finger that lived before nearly everything else. We still don't know whether Sand Whisper's marks are the product of convergent creativity, distant cultural exchange, or the remains of a ritual language that once held communities together across kilometers of land and water. Not all mysteries at Fort Knox involve stones, lines, or marks. Sometimes the most perplexing things are sounds. There's a low, periodic thrum that people near a particular ridge called Iron Hollow swear they can hear on certain nights, a sustained, distant like the earth itself is humming under a slow, deliberate pulse. The teaser is short. Iron Hollow hums with an acoustic anomaly that refuses easy explanation. Field recordings made by an enterprising graduate student captured an infrasonic frequency, a sound below the range of human hearing but capable of playing tricks on human perception, creating a sensation of unease or presence. Geologists note that such frequencies can be produced by wind interacting with cavities or by the slow release of stress along fault lines. But Iron Hollow lies outside known active fault zones, and the frequency pattern does not match typical environmental sources like wind or river flows. Theories here split along disciplinary lines. Geophysicists argue for a natural cause, a deep, karstic chamber where subterranean air currents create a resonant frequency under certain atmospheric conditions. Biologists, by contrast, have pointed out that large gatherings of insects or microfauna can create collective auditory phenomena that register only as a continuous hum at certain distances. Anthropologists, tuned to the stories people tell when they hear such things, remind us that acoustic phenomena often attract ritual meaning. Hums get named, they become ghosts, they become warnings. The local lore at Iron Hollow is a patchwork. One story tells of an ancient bell buried by a people who believed sound connects worlds. Another claims a giant machine of lost origin lies under the ground, its gears turning beneath our feet. Picture yourself standing at the ridge's edge at midnight, the air thin, a sense of pressure at the base of your skull. The hum is a presence you cannot touch, only sense, and that perceptual gap makes it a perfect seed for legend. We still don't know whether the hum is a simple physical phenomenon amplified by human attention, a localized natural resonance with no cultural import, or a phenomenon that helps shape ritual practice in ways we've yet to record. But if nothing else, Iron Hollow teaches us that mystery can be sensorial as well as spatial. We are creatures who listen as well as look. What we hear can shape what we believe. And when the land itself seems to speak, people tend to answer, in stone, in song, or in story. By now you may notice a pattern, and of course patterns are the twin delights and dangers of investigation. On the one hand, the recurrence of certain motifs, long-distance materials, astronomical alignments, submerged structures, petroglyphs that resemble coastal iconography, and inexplicable natural phenomena, suggests that whatever story unfolded here cannot be told from one dig site alone. On the other hand, each place pushes a different kind of question. Do we interpret similar material traces as evidence of widespread networks, or as the repeated output of local ingenuity? Do anomalous dates mean our methods need refining, or that we are facing evidence of practices that sustained over centuries, intentional conservatism of ritual knowledge? The real task is not to find one theory to rule them all, but to hold these tensions side by side long enough for a more nuanced narrative to emerge. And that is precisely what we will do in the next segments, where we push farther into the terrain, meet more evidence, and let the land speak. If you're still with me, good. Keep that curiosity sharp. We are not treasure hunters seeking the sensational so much as detectives of time, trying to read the handwriting left in earth and stone. Some of the handwriting is clear. Some of it looks like a palimpsest, a text that has been written, scraped away, and then written over. That is the real beauty of places like Fort Knox. They force humility. For every confident stroke that science offers, the landscape answers with a smudge that reminds us of our limits. And yet those smudges are not failures. They are invitations. They say, softly, insistently, look again. The next place we step into feels at once intimate and enormous. A ring of low earthen mounds dotting a wooded knoll the locals call Echo Barrow, where the earth seems to carry your voice a fraction longer than it should. The teaser is simple and irresistible. Echo Barrow keeps voices and secrets longer than sound alone should allow. Archaeological surveys first noted the Barrow sequence during a county-wide inventory in the late 1930s. But serious excavation only began in the 1970s, when graduate students from a regional university opened trenches in 3 of the mounds. Stratigraphy suggests repeated use, layers of ash and charcoal separated by sterile clays, with human interments and offerings placed at different horizons. The earliest radiocarbon samples return dates centered around 450 BC to 150 C. Which places the earliest activity in what we commonly label as the Middle Woodland Era, a time when mound-building cultures were experimenting with form and scale. The mounds are modest in size, ranging from about 2 to 4 meters in height and 8 to 20 meters in diameter, but their arrangement, a shallow arc hugging a small spring, reads like a ritual amphitheater. Key discoveries here included carefully arranged burials with grave goods, intricately notched bone awls, small copper ornaments, and a cache of freshwater pearls. Most puzzling were a series of thin, worked stone plates, each engraved with faint parallel grooves that, when stacked, produced a pattern of resonance, literally, a musical score in stone. Acoustic testing carried out by an interdisciplinary team in the early 2000s recorded a set of low harmonics when the plates were struck together, and the spring's stone basin amplifies certain frequencies in the low register. In other words, Echo Barrow is both cemetery and instrument. But here's where it gets tricky. Do the grooves indicate a deliberate musical technology, or are they the incidental byproduct of a production technique for stone smoothing? Some experimental archaeologists have tried to reproduce the plates and failed to create the same harmonic richness without a very specific method of shaping and tempering that looks, frankly, sophisticated. Another theory suggests that the plates were not musical instruments at all but were markers used to encode genealogies or star charts, the grooves acting as mnemonic devices rather than tone producers. The presence of metal ornaments suggests involvement in long-distance exchange networks, but the pearls and freshwater materials root the assemblage in local riverine ecology. Now, let's be fair, our modern ears are conditioned to music as we know it, and the acoustic properties we find compelling might have been marginal for the people who made and used these plates. Still, for all the science, Echo Barrow insists there was an intention linking sound, memory, and the dead. Myth crowns the site with a sterling, eerie gloss. Several elders from nearby communities tell a recurring story about a stone choir that could call rain or still the wind, a group of ritualists whose songs were said to move stones and whose graves were marked by the plates we now excavate. A 19th century account, probably romanticized by a traveling antiquarian, claims a farmer uncovered a plate and took it home, only to hear a chorus in the night until he returned the piece to the mound. Sensational? Certainly. Useful? Also, because legend often preserves kernels of social meaning that archaeology alone can miss. Picture yourself at the spring at dawn, your breath a small cloud, the plates laid out before you on a towel of moss. You tap them gently with a bone stick and hear a sound that moves through your chest more than your ears. It is intimate and uncanny. The world feels fuller. We still don't know whether Echo Barrow was a deliberate sonic architecture designed to stitch community and cosmos, a mnemonic repository, or a collection of ceremonial objects whose function has quietly slipped away with the centuries. The uncertainty is a kind of music in itself, unresolved, resonant. A little farther off, where a line of maples leans like a natural colonnade, you find an entirely different sort of puzzle, a long, straight feature carved into the bedrock and filled with broken ceramics, charcoal, and compacted earth that locals call the Traveler's Causeway. The teaser for this place is a short, elegant phrase, a road of the dead or the living, cut into stone and stubbornly persistent on the landscape. Surveyors first logged the causeway in the 1920s when it showed up on a farmer's field map as a strange linear anomaly. Modern geophysical work including resistivity and ground-penetrating radar reveals a linear feature nearly 300 meters long and approximately 2.5 to 3 meters wide, with shallow, regularly spaced post holes suggesting some form of covering or framework. The dating evidence is complex. Charcoal from associated hearths yields dates clustered around 900 to 1200 C, squarely in the late woodland to Mississippian transition, but deeper, sealed contexts produced a small number of older dates, suggesting the alignment may have been used across many centuries. Key finds in and around the causeway include a broad assortment of pottery sherds, including shell-tempered ceramics typical of Mississippian influence, and earlier grit-tempered wares. Traces of bitumen-like residues were also found, chemically similar to sealants used in portable artifact preservation in coastal contexts. One of the more perplexing features is a repeating pattern of stone alignments perpendicular to the causeway, appearing at roughly 30 to 40 meter intervals, regular spacing that suggests planned measurement. Excavators proposed several functions: a pilgrimage path linking sacred places, a ceremonial procession route for elite display, or a simple functional track used to transport goods between seasonal camps. Another provocative theory argues that the causeway was a defensive earthwork adapted into a ceremonial route, its repeated perpendicular features representing checkpoints or ritual stations. Skeptics counter that natural erosion and plowing could create artificial regularity in the sediment profile and that post holes might represent later fence lines unrelated to an original pathway. Still, the scale and regularity seduce the imagination. Something deliberate was being laid down, measured, and maintained. When you listen to the oral histories around the causeway, a certain gravitas surfaces. Elders speak of long processions, of warriors and women in painted cloaks moving along the path to the rhythm of drums, their feet wearing channels into the earth over generations. A more Gothic local legend says the causeway is a road built by giants, whose footsteps compressed the land into the long, straight scar we see now. Picture yourself walking the causeway at dusk, the maples whispering above, something like a memory of thousands of footsteps brushing your ears. You feel the planned intervals as if you were stepping into a choreography older than your own life. We still don't know whether Travelers Causeway was built as a structured ceremonial avenue, an engineered trade route, or a later feature misread by archaeologists chasing pattern over process. Whatever its origin, it invites us to imagine movement, not just of goods but of people's bodies, songs, and reputations, across a landscape that has been lived in again and again. Close by, in a low orchard that hums with bees and memory, is a place the neighbors call the Silver Orchard, a grove of old apple trees with an odd archaeological wrinkle, interstitial spaces where small caches of worked metal have been dug up through the years. The teaser is direct. The orchard hides traces of metalworking practices that complicate our assumptions about local technological chronology. Farmers have long found small items in the orchard soil, copper beads, thin wire fragments, a few tiny, inconclusive pieces of hammered foil. Systematic excavation yielded a shallow workshop area, concentrations of slag-like residues, vitrified clay fragments, and a few tiny crucible fragments that suggest high-temperature processing. The scientific dating of organic remains in the immediate context clusters around 400 to 700 CE, but there are older charcoal flecks suggesting episodic, perhaps ritual, use well before this. So what do we make of these scraps and residues? One school of thought argues that Silver Orchard was a modest metallurgical locus, not smelting or on-site, because the evidence for large-scale smelting is absent, but perhaps cold working and annealing of preformed metal ingots traded from afar. This would make the orchard part of a network of craft specialization, local artisans finishing materials sourced from more distant suppliers. Another theory, less conservative, speculates that the residues point to early indigenous experimentation with native copper and that the region participated in a lost tradition of small-scale smelting much earlier than generally acknowledged. A third suggestion, proffered by a few amateur historians and repeated on regional forums, hints at anachronistic metal objects that imply European contact earlier than official accounts, a theory that mainstream archaeology consistently rejects on method grounds, noting contamination and intrusive burials as likely culprits. The evidence is ambiguous enough to support several plausible readings, but not robust enough to settle the more sensational claims. Now, let's be fair, metallurgy leaves fingerprints, chemical markers, slag morphology, furnace remains, and Silver Orchard provides some but not all of those markers. Still, for all the restraint of good science, the orchard remains a place where the idea of metal shimmers into view and refuses to be fully captured. Local lore here is particularly rich and peculiarly intimate. An old woman who tended the orchard until her death in 2011 told the story of silver that sang when the moon was full, meaning files and hammers ringing from the workshop as artisans labored by lamplight. Children were warned not to take anything from the orchard lest the metal call you away. Picture yourself sitting beneath a low branch as bees pass in and out, holding a tiny copper bead the color of a penny but softer to the touch, imagining hands shaping it centuries ago. The scene makes the past tactile, human. We still don't know whether Silver Orchard was a node of localized metalworking, a finishing workshop for traded metals, or a place of ritualized craft that mingled the mundane and the sacred. Whatever the truth, the orchard suggests that technology and belief were braided in ways our categories of craft and ceremony might not fully capture. Across a field that in summer is a riot of milkweed and grass, there is a dramatic, almost cinematic place called Night Watch Cairn, a stone pile perched on a low hill that seems to face the horizon like a sentinel. The teaser is evocative. Night Watch Cairn is an alignment of memory and the dead, with a single coffin chamber that refuses easy explanation. The cairn is modest, roughly 12 meters across and 2 meters high, but its internal chamber is something else, carefully lined with flat stone slabs, sealed with a layer of compact clay, and containing skeletal remains that, when first examined in the 1980s, seemed to show individuals of unusually tall stature compared to other regional skeletal samples. Osteologists initially reported a mean stature several centimeters above regional norms for comparable periods, and there were pathologies suggestive of heavy, repetitive physical labor. Grave goods included a few large projectile points, an array of shell ornaments, and inexplicably, the partial remains of a slate tablet incised with linear marks. The scientific debates here multiply quickly. One line of argument proposes that the tallness is within normal variation when broader regional samples are considered. Selection bias and small sample size may have skewed initial interpretations. Another view suggests that the individuals interred in Night Watch Cairn represent an elite lineage who, because of diet or selective marriage, achieved greater stature, perhaps comparable to other, chiefly, cemeteries observed across the southeast where elites sometimes show distinct physical markers. A more sensational cluster of accounts, often amplified by late-night talk show hosts or sensationalist writers, seized upon the initial stature reports to suggest the presence of giants, an idea deeply embedded in many folk traditions. Scientists push back hard. The giant stories are not supported by robust, reproducible osteological data once re-examinations account for variables like preservation and measurement error. The slate tablets' incised marks remain a stubborn enigma. A cipher? A tally? A ritual tally of seasons? The lines do not match any known regional script. Some practical analysts suggest they are tally marks linked to trade or feasting cycles. Others urge caution, saying the incisions could be graffiti of a later period. Night Watch Cairn's mythic language is potent. Stories persist of a watchman who would climb the hill and see ships on a landlocked horizon, an impossibility that voices shaped into prophecy and fear. Other tales tell of a lineage of protectors whose graves were kept open until the last sentinel died, and then the cairn was closed in a single ritual of finality. Picture yourself on the cairn at twilight, the stones warm from the day but cooling fast, the horizon dissolving into purple. You crouch at the chamber's mouth, imagining the people whose bones lie inside not as strange curiosities but as neighbors with long names and private jokes. We still don't know whether Night Watch Cairn marks an elite family, a community of unusually tall individuals, or an ordinary cemetery later reframed by rumor into the supernatural. What we do know is that stones make excellent stages for myth, and humans are very good at telling stories that transform ordinary lives into epic ones. As we near the end of our field circuit, it helps to step back and hold these sites together in one look. Stonewatch's deliberate megaliths aligning with the sky, golden ridges technologic hints and contested dates, the submerged grids drown geometry, sand whispers coastal echoes inland, echo barrows sonic memory, traveler's causeway's straight measured line, silver orchard's metallic shimmer, and Night Watch Cairn's sentinel dead. Each place offers a puzzle piece, some smoothed by time, others ragged with debate. Each invites multiple readings, archaeological, geophysical, mythic, and local, and those readings sometimes cooperate and sometimes snap at each other like siblings around a family heirloom. The temptation to resolve everything into a single coherent story is strong, but that temptation often blinds us to the texture that disagreement itself reveals. The landscape is not a single book with a tidy narrative but a library of overlapping volumes, margins filled with notes from different hands across centuries. When we try to force them all into a single spine, we lose the margin notes. So what does it mean that science cannot, at least yet, explain these things completely? First, it shows us the limitations of our methods and the humility required to practice real inquiry. Radiocarbon dating gives us ranges, not fingerprints. Geophysics reveals shapes but cannot read intention. Oral traditions preserve memory but also rework it to serve living needs. Each method offers a lens. The trick is using several lenses together and listening to their dissonance. Second, the ambiguity teaches us something about cultural continuity and change. Sometimes communities preserve rituals and alignments across centuries because those practices anchor identity. Sometimes similar material expressions appear in different places because human minds work within a common repertoire of form and meaning. Both possibilities are interesting, either precludes the other. Third, these unsolved mysteries matter because they reconfigure how we imagine the deep past of this place. They complicate the tidy story of linear progress and instead suggest a landscape of encounters, trade, pilgrimage, adaptation, innovation, and loss. And there is a human cost to unresolved puzzles. When scientific authority is uncertain, Amateur explanations rush in to fill the vacuum, often smoothing complexity into sensational narratives that do real damage. Looting, misinterpretation, the commercialization of grief. Conversely, when communities feel excluded from the ownership of their own past, distrust grows. In many of the meetings I attended with local communities while researching these places, the single concern that rose repeatedly was not academic correctness but voice. Who gets to tell these stories? Archaeologists, for all their lab coats, are still human. They live in communities, carry biases, and sometimes, quite humanly, fall in love with a theory and stubbornly defend it. Meanwhile, elders and families carry their own archives, sometimes recorded, often passed in speech. The healthiest path forward is one where science and memory converse, where carbon dates and songlines both have seats at the table. Practically speaking, what would it take to move from mystery toward firmer answers? Better sampling and context is the short answer. Carefully controlled excavations, expanded radiocarbon programs, refined geophysical prospection, and broader comparative studies that do not force one region's typology onto another's context. Ethnoarchaeology, bringing in living cultural practices to illuminate ancient techniques, could be powerful, especially for places like Echo Barrow and Silver Orchard where craft and ritual seem braided. Importantly, repatriation conversations and partnerships with descendant communities must not be an optional add-on. They are essential. Many of the artifacts and practices we dig up remain living parts of cultural identity for people in the region, and their participation is not simply ethical but generative. It can reshape research questions in productive ways. But even with the best tools, some questions may remain generative rather than conclusive. That is not a failing but a kind of grace. Mystery keeps us moving rather than resting. It makes us better listeners. When we accept that some things will resist our grasp, we also accept the possibility of wonder. At places like Fort Knox's less publicized ancient sites, where vaults guard metal and the land guards memory, wonder and skepticism must be friends. Wonder without skepticism becomes credulity. Skepticism without wonder becomes sterile dismissal. Both together let us make room for curiosity and for the painstaking work of evidence. We have walked the fields, read the grooves in stone with our fingertips, listened for the hum under the ridge, and imagined processions along stone-cut causeways. We have heard elders' voices and lab reports' measured tones. We have encountered hypotheses that range from the prudently conservative to the deliciously outrageous. What do these tensions finally teach us about being human? They teach us that our species has, since time immemorial, been both practical and poetic. We cultivate fields and compose songs, we trade beads and build calendars, we bury our dead and sometimes leave objects meant to sing to the living. Places accumulate meanings, meanings accumulate myths, myths become archives in their own right. Those archives are not less real for being layered with fable. They are, in fact, closer to the true texture of human life. So where does that leave you, and us, and the next person who walks into a field at Fort Knox and notices an odd stone, or a line in the silt, or a sound that lingers? It leaves us with a task that is embarrassingly simple: to look closely, to listen patiently, and to act with humility. It leaves us with an ethical demand to protect the landscape, both physically and narratively, from those who would simplify it for clicks or profit. It leaves us with a joy, the knowledge that mystery survives because we keep being curious. Some secrets will be solved in the laboratory, and some will remain, stubbornly, the province of story. Both outcomes are gifts. I want to end where we began, with a gentle insistence. Fort Knox may guard gold, but the older treasures here are subtle: a sound that refuses a single source, a stone circle that remembers an early dawn, a line of cobble that still suggests processional feet. Those are the things that rearrange our sense of time and our sense of belonging. They remind us that even in a nation obsessed with accounting and inventories, the land keeps its own ledger in a language we are still learning to read. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.